thank you for these comments. I know it's a bit of a strange setup. Yes, because you'll have to sort of see everyone. I know technology has derailed us, so we're running out of time, and I know some of you may have places to go. I suggest we'll run a bit over, but maybe if that's okay with all of you, in the interest of time, we'll move directly to questions from the audience, and you can answer Bruno in the process. So hopefully, if some of you have questions, so.
Do you need us to move? Or
do you want? Okay.
Yes, please.
So I really enjoyed all three papers. I had a comment actually for Steph. So I was struck that the one word you didn't mention was surrealism, because it just seems that the tentacles of surrealism are all through your story. I mean, starting with the surrealist as the sort of redemptive movement against colonialism, but also that cross-cultural encounter with the object de motif, and then of course just the personnel. I mean, Léris and then Breton and Lévi-Strauss in New York. So I was wondering, does that fit? Can you just slip that in, or would surrealism make a different story?
I don't know how the story would be different. That is to say, most of the writing that actually links these people together generally begins with surrealist ethnography and with documents and so on. And so I don't have a sense of having an objection to this. I think the obsessiveness about the other is a post-war obsessiveness that among anthropologists. It's not nearly as explicit before. The gesture of coming back to Europe, of coming to Paris, of seeing, describing, that precedes, but the sense of, I don't know how to describe it, I wouldn't call it provincializing or othering Europe itself, but having to handle these others and then looking back at Europe itself would be relatively a little newer. It's not that these are separate, stories. It's that also the surrealist in Léris is kind of absent after 1945, really after the appendix to L'Âge d'Homme. And then when he goes back into the ethnographic work should not be deemed as merely surrealist. The surrealist ethnography argument is a fantastic one. But after 45, it's kind of astonishing how technical most of his writings are. This goes back to Bruno's question, and then I'll close on this, on the homogenization issue. With Lévi-Strauss, this is the famous passage about the islands becoming aircraft carriers anchored into particular points of the sea. And it's a very similar argument that Léris would sort of seemingly spontaneously deploy, that would go back to Bataille and the sort of broader phenomenological questions about the same, that would go back to the normal and Canguilhem and then to Foucault forward. That's a sort of hideously reductive sort of treatment, but there's something about this obsession with the kind of same and other that seems to be replicating, so that the language is translatable. That's part of what I have in mind. That seems to me a slightly newer language than that of surrealism, and it seems to be in the same picture. I'll stop here in the interest of time.
Yes, Dan.
Well, I also really enjoyed all these papers, and I also have a question for Stefanos. It was, I just wondered, I mean, in the constellation of people you were talking about, there was one name that I missed, which was Plenary. And I just wonder to what extent what's going on with the consolidation of anthropology in and around 1950 is also in part or part of an ongoing struggle for preeminence in the social sciences, in which, of course, historians was later took part. And Balandier was sort of betwixt and between, but he certainly identified as a sociologist while also participating in critique of colonialism. So I just want, and the sort of the different relationships between sociology and anthropology and universalism, I think it might also be part of this.
There are fantastic lectures by Balandier in the sort of Quartet de Bibliothèque de la Sorbonne and Think, and then in the he doesn't teach at the Salon, but and then the Bibliothèque Nationale. And they are the most interesting ones, which come very closely to this material concern critiques of economic development. And that's the one line. I didn't have a sense of putting him in the same context insofar as he is essentially a different generation. These are people who are more or less of the same age.
Alive.
Sorry?
He's still alive.
So is it Cousins of recently, but they're still of the same generation. And I don't mean to, I'm not meaning to belittle that. I just think that this is very much a pre-war generation. My argument would be that this is a pre-war generation that comes into very different constellation around 1945 to 1950, and that then somehow looks at the world with that particular shift in place, and that then becomes all the more vocal in different directions. And this would go to Dan's question, and to Bruno's question as well. Regarding universalism, I think that these are all critical gestures. I don't mean to displace Valandier. I think he is much more of Parisian in that regard, and much more the arguments regarding development are also within the same phasm as I mentioned. But I don't have the time to really deploy on that part. I think that these are critiques. They are not gestures whose limits are clear. But it's clear that Lévi-Strauss doesn't care about the limits of the gesture. It's clear that someone like Lévis is not particularly concerned when he signs and helps participate in the Manifesto of 121. It's clear that he doesn't really think that it's going to go much, much further. All of the political gestures there, I think, are forms of critique. And that negative form of universalist practice is up to the point that I would go. That you can sort of do that by way of a difference, and then the limits of that really get in the mid-60s. And so that's not quite a satisfying. I'm not satisfied with the answer.
I think Jimmy had a question.
A question for Ken. A question basically, I guess, about the order of reasons. And this has to do with the relation between things that I have some sympathy for and things that I have no sympathy for whatsoever. I wonder to what extent the critique of the reduction of politics to a rights-based juristic framework is necessarily linked to the defense of the Republic as a social order, and above all as a symbolic order, right? To a large extent, the sort of current way that French attitudes on the relation between gay marriage and gay adoption line up is sort of, y a l'autre symbolique quand même, right? And I'm not convinced that Gaucher's original position leads to this in some logical way. And I suppose one of the ways that I express that is that I think that you could argue that the argument of Wendy Brown's states of injury is precisely human rights is not a politics.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. But I think, again, there's a kind of interesting problem of cross-Atlantic translations or mistranslations in terms of what privacy means. And so, what's interesting is that here, of course, in the States, or in this Anglo-Saxon world, there also has been a critique of privacy from people like Wendy Brown, people like Lauren Berland, people who think of themselves on the left of liberalism. But that is usually, as you say, not to reaffirm a kind of symbolic social republic. What's interesting to me is that in France, that's been the way that it's gone, sort of since the 80s. No, privacy has served that function. So it might be something. It might have something to do with the histories of the concept of privacy in both countries. And there's a really interesting article by James Whitman at Yale Law, who kind of says, traces these different tendencies, and basically says that privacy, in the U.S. and in France have a completely different basically function, and that privacy in France has often been about re-solidifying a kind of social order. So perhaps it has to do with a kind of legal history, but I don't think it has to go there, but I think it does in France.
Yes, I have a question for both Camille and Julian about long-term continuities. In the case of Debray, his autobiography seems to be filled with references to 19th century revolutionary traditions, whether in France or in his Hispanic world. So it is, you know, any of his sort of idea of the guerrilla really a kind of new thing from the post-Algerian war period, and how much is it just kind of dusting off the sort of revolutionary myths of the 19th century, and then in relation to communautarisme, which yes has become so kind of ubiquitous since the 1980s. The term. I mean, was Gaucher actually the first person to use the term in 1980, or does it appear in earlier Republican discourse?
I have not seen the term communautarisme before the 1980s. I think it becomes, that's the time in which it emerges. And I think initially it does have to do with the rise of the National Front, with the kind of questions around immigration, and then it sort of shifts to questions of gender and sexuality in the 90s. But I think that's when it happens.
Debré is between 61 and 67 is very clear that Maoism and European-style Leninism have no place in Latin America. The irony is that he goes to Cuba in 1961, but then from 63 to 65, when he comes back to France and finishes his degree and teaches philosophy, he's not in Cuba. And so Cuba is a figuration, and the question is, can the Cuban example be applied throughout Latin America? So he is trying to import Cheism or Castroism through Latin America, but it is very clear that both the Chinese and European-based models, at least in the mid-60s, early to mid-60s, have no place in the distinct. And Latin America is distinct as a whole, and that trickles down into national distinctiveness. And that has continuity when he comes back to France.
Can we afford 5 more minutes? Or?
The other panel will need to set up.
Oh, okay. Unfortunately, technology requires that we must end. So thank you very much.